Right. I
and
knew where
drink
that
his
was.
and drink his dinner and drink his dinner. And then he would come back in and go on the air slurring his words at 11:15. So man, I'm like a pig, and you know what? I'm so happy. Man, I can take a cab over to the Olympia to cover a Red Wings game. You know, you couldn't even get into Red Wings games when I was a boy growing up because the tickets were so hard to get. Now I get in for free. I'll never forget. I said, Bob, let's go to the Wings game tonight together. He said, no, I can't, Bob. No, I said, oh, come on, man, we'll have a good time. You get back in time for the show. I'll do my interviews, and I'll bring them back in time for the 11:15 show. He says, no, I can't, Bob. I said, why can't you? He said, I don't want to break my streak. I said, what's your streak? He said, I haven't been to a Red Wings game in 20 years. I said, you're the sports director at the flagship station for the Detroit Red Wings.
And you don't go to the
Wings
games.
10 minutes out our door, and you haven't been to a Red Wings game in 20 years? So that's what I was dealing with. And finally, the Lions got me fired at WJR, which made me a hot commodity. I was 25 years old. I was just a kid. And I was hired by Channel 7 in Detroit. And, well, anyway, my career just kind of went from there. I'm sorry to be so long-winded.
No. That's great because people don't understand. I mean, a lot of individuals think somebody like yourself is an overnight sensation. You know, young 25-year-old. They don't understand in broadcasting, you know, I call it, you know, like the Beatles had the long and winding road. I call it the long and grinding road.
Yeah, unless your name is Jim Nance or Bob Costas, because they were kids who got a big break early and they ran with it. You know, but those guys are obviously highly unusual people.
I mean, but you worked radio in Lansing, didn't you, at JIM at a time?
Radio and TV, radio and television. I anchored the Saturday night sports, and I did street reporting for television and radio during the week, and I did updates on WJIM, you know, radio, where I once breathlessly told everybody that George McGinnis had just signed a, quote, multi-million-year contract with the Indiana Pacers.
Multi-million-year.
And I had a couple other slip-ups like that, too, but we all do.
Who was a teacher or a coach when you were young that guided you and impacted your world?
Well, that's a great question. And I'm gonna say, I think you know this about me, but a lot of people who know who I am don't. I was a musician. I was a singer and a guitar player in the 60s. I never played I was a very good basketball and baseball player, but I never played high school sports. I mean, I had some boyhood coaches, I guess, who had an impact on me, but I wanted to be a folk rock star. So we wrote all of our own material back in the late 60s. We were in every recording. By the time I was 17 or 18, I'd recorded in every studio in Detroit except the obvious one, Motown. And that's really kind of what I wanted to do. So I think there were coaches, you know, when I was an all-star Little League player and an all-star Babe Ruth League player, that kind of thing. But, you know, I don't really remember any of them having a tremendous impact. Teachers, there were some teachers who had a big impact on my life. No question about that. And I will never forget. And of course, at this stage of our lives, they're all gone, you know.
Yeah.
Almost all of them.
Yeah, I still have my 9th grade football coach that I still stay in touch with from.
Yeah, where did you play? Where'd you go to high school?
I went to high school at Stevenson in Livonia.
Yeah. Well, I would have gone to Livonia Franklin because I lived the first part of my life in what they now call laughingly old Rosedale Gardens. It was just Rosedale Gardens, which was such a great place to grow up in the 50s and 60s. And I would have gone to Franklin. And I don't want to bore your listeners who don't know much about or anything about Detroit geography, but my parents were Duke educated. My father graduated from Duke Law School as well. And my mother felt it was important that we get the best education we could, which was not going to be in Livonia, Michigan. So that's why we moved to Grosse Pointe in time for, you know, the start of my junior high school, my first year in junior high school. Yeah.
So did you go, so it was Grosse Pointe North?
Well, that didn't exist. It was just Grosse Pointe High School.
All right.
Dating myself. But and again, I presume you probably have a lot of Detroit listeners, and they can relate to this. They know what we're talking about at least. But my senior class in high school. Are you ready for that? You don't have to be from Michigan to understand what I mean here. My senior class, only my senior class had 1,200 kids in it. 1,200. What happened was Grosse Pointe North was built our senior year, but because we had all gone to school together, that we're not going to break these kids up because they're all friends, boyfriends, girlfriends, whatever you got going on. So we graduated intact from what was then Grosse Pointe South and what is now Grosse Pointe South. Yeah.
Okay. I gotcha. How'd you end up at Michigan State? What was why did you choose State?
I ended up at Michigan State for the same reason virtually everybody ends up at Michigan State, because I couldn't get into Michigan. That's why. I was a huge Michigan fan growing up in Detroit. I didn't know anything about Michigan State except the fact that I hated them. And I would watch he was such a terrific guy, the great Bill Fleming, do his Big Ten basketball game of the week every Saturday afternoon. He was watching the games, and sometimes, Michigan would play Michigan State, and they had Stan Washington and Marcus Sanders and Bill Curtis and Matthew H. I hated those guys. So what happened is that I didn't attend high school very much. I was a musician. I was a child of the 60s. We played gigs in Ann Arbor. We played gigs at coffee houses around Detroit. I wasn't too interested in school, so I almost flunked my junior year. So it comes time for me to go to college, and I'm going to Eastern Michigan, with my best friend. We're going to get a room together. We're probably going to flunk out. We're going to, smoke dope, and we're going to play guitar, and we're going to have a great time at Eastern. My mother said, my dad was dead at this point. My mother said to me, she said, just apply to Michigan State. I'm not applying to Michigan State. I hate Michigan State. She said, well, just apply. They're not going to accept me, Mom. So I applied to Michigan State. They send me a letter and they say, because of your high IQ scores and your high test scores, even though your grades are laughable, we can't obviously accept you, but we have something called the Student Test Admit Program, where if you come up in January to East Lansing and spend 8 hours taking day-long admissions tests, if you pass those tests, you will then be allowed to attend Michigan State for one semester only, the summer semester, right after you graduate from high school. If you take a full credit load that summer semester and you get at least a 2.0 grade point average, then you will be a real Michigan State student. That's what I did. And I showed up, for the first day, Michigan State, met my roommate, said, let's take a walk around the campus. I'd never been there before, except for that 8-hour test, the 8-hour test I had gone through, and it was snowy and miserable and horrendous. Now it's summertime. Well, let's take a walk around. Couldn't believe how beautiful the Michigan State campus was.
Yeah, it is very beautiful.
Yeah, and at least part of it. And so that was it. That's how I wound up at Michigan State. Another long-winded answer to your good question.
Yeah, I spent 6 years at Whittle, 1010 a.m.
WITL, the country music station.
Working there. I'm speaking with Bob Page, sportscaster extraordinaire for me, Detroit, New York, and we'll get into some of those things. But Bob, if anybody follows you, like your Twitter feed or anything, you are well-versed in a lot of subjects. And you just don't throw out opinions. You do throw out your opinion quite often, yet it's with factual backing.
With thought, in other words.
Yeah. So as a sportscaster, sports journalist.
Yeah, I've always called myself actually a sports commentator.
When I
think of sportscasters, I think of play-by-play guys.
Okay.
Which is not me. Yeah.
Now, you working inside some of, in New York City and Detroit, did the news journalists, did they ever look down their nose at the sports department at all, or what was that interaction like?
I've never felt that personally, because I think that virtually every news guy I ever worked with was, of course, a big sports fan. So a lot of times they wish they could do it. So I broke into the business again at WJIM in Lansing, and we had a radio news director there. He just did news, but he was a sports fan too. And he would do high school basketball and football games in the Lansing area on Friday nights. His name, George Blaha.
Ah, yeah.
Frank Beckman comes to me when I'm at WJR already. And they're looking for a Pistons play-by-play announcer because Tom Hemingway was a great guy and a wonderful play-by-play guy out of the University of Michigan. They'd fired Tom because when the Pistons won 16 games, they didn't think he was positive enough. They actually fired him. So Frank Beckman came to me and he said, well, we're thinking about hiring. I know you worked with George Blaha in Lansing. We're thinking about hiring him. What do you think about that? And I said, George he's a good guy. He's got a great set of pipes. He's very good on high school basketball. Why not take a chance? Go ahead and do it. And the rest has been history.
Yes.
Never, ever left that job. And I told Beckman, Beckman says, well, I think what we're going to do is going to change his name to George Blake. I said, I wouldn't. And here's why. So this kindergarten teacher in Lansing once sent us this drawing in the mail. It arrives, and it's just a child scribbles with crayon. She sent it to us because she went over to little Susie, who had created this, and she said, so Susie, that's interesting. What is this? And little Susie says, that's a George Blaha. I mean, when 6-year-old little girls know who you are, know what your name is, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah,
so
that is.
They kept the name George Blaha, and George has made a lot of money over the many years doing Detroit Pistons games.
and so many of us have, good years, bad years, been able to listen to the Pistons.
And George, again, look, I love George, but George has never seen any evil. He's never heard any evil. He's never spoken any evil. That's how George Blaha has kept his job all these years.
So you're the man that replaced Howard Cosell.
I am, on his radio show. Uh-huh.
On the radio show out of MSG, correct?
No, ABC Radio in New York.
Radio.
I was already an anchor, a television anchor at Madison Square Garden Network in New York, and I had done very well with that for a number of years. So when the opening, they basically kicked Cosell out. He just was losing it, and lost a lot of affiliates. It wasn't good. They called me up. Shelby Whitfield was the sports director who hired me, whom I had known for a long time. He called me up and said, look, we want you to take over for Cosell, but we can't just fire him right now. So we're going to let him keep one of his commentaries. I think, again, older people know these shows well. Hello again, everyone. This is Howard Cosell. Speaking of sports. Yeah. So they gave me one of his shows, and they let him keep one of his shows. It was not a lot of fun. Howard hated me. Howard hated everybody. Howard hated Costas. He hated anybody who was a young broadcaster. He hated us all. So he goes to Shelby Whitfield, and he said to him, I saw your man Page on television again last night. He has no talent. Why is he here with us? And Shelby said, well, Howard, I know you don't like Bob, and a lot of people don't like Bob, but you can't say that Bob has no talent. He has no talent. But Howard, Bob says that you're one of the biggest influences on his career. Oh, yeah? What career is that? So that's what it was like until they finally, they took his last show away from him, and it just killed Howard, It was too bad. Another famous broadcasting name from that era, I only met him once. I can't say I knew him. But at a banquet in New York, I had a long chat with him one night, and I'm talking about NBC TV's Jim Simpson. And at that point in time, Jim's career was, I don't know how old he was, but he was, he was older and on the downside, on the way out. So he was left, NBC had gotten rid of him. The only thing he had going was he would do an Ivy League football game of the week on Sports Channel or something like that. And I remember talking to Jim about his philosophy about broadcasting and about life. And he said, I am so eternally grateful to have done what I was able to do. I never worked. It was so much fun. And even now, I'm having fun on these Ivy League games. And it's all been great. How could I be bitter? And I never forgot that. Yeah. Cosell was bitter from the day one. I used to do...
He was born bitter.
I had a lot of time on my hands in the daytime because I was doing nighttime television in New York, and I'm single and by myself. So I did some volunteer work with certain agencies, one of which, I'm not Jewish, but this was a Jewish social services agency where you go visit with senior citizens and so on, try to cheer them up. So I did that. And I had this one guy I visited all the time named Herman from Brooklyn, New York. And we would talk about Cosell because he had grown up with Cosell in Brooklyn. And I can still hear Herman telling me, Bob, never ever say that Howard Cosell is a bit of old man. Howard Cosell was a bit of young man. We all hated him. So that was Howard's MO, you know? I mean, he took for granted everything. He was unhappy. He was miserable. While Jim Simpson, on the other hand, who didn't have the career Howard did, nobody did. Jim Simpson was just so grateful. And so, Bob, at this stage of my life, I never worked a day in my life.
Yeah.
Of course, I went through ups and downs. And of course, I got fired because I was controversial and all that. But I'm just so grateful for what I was able to do, what I did accomplish, and all the amazing times and the fun that I had, instead of sitting around thinking, yeah, well, I could have done more. I should have been bigger than I was. I should have done more. I don't feel that way.
You know, you mentioned the word controversial. I find it very hard to listen to sports talk radio today.
It's not for us. It's not for us.
There's a million of them out there, and they're all so negative.
And I don't think about that. I don't care about that. The only audience that they want is 18 to 34. It is dude radio by dudes for dudes. It is about bitchin' babes and brewskis. That's what sports talk radio is about. And I think that's great because believe me, when I was 18 to 34, if I could have had an opportunity to do that, wow, that would have been so amazing. It would have been great. But the advertisers, the consultants, you know, the empty suits who run sports broadcasting, they're not interested really in sitting around hearing guys our age do intelligent sports talk aimed at a relatively sophisticated audience. They don't care about that. So the recent podcast that I had for 2 years with Eli Zaret and Denny McClain, yeah, sure, we had a lot of fun. We had a lot of laughs, but we aimed at a higher level. And so I think that we had a lot of listeners. And I think
that was a great podcast too.
Thank you very much. I always tell Zaret, who ended it, pissed me off to the nth degree, though he's still my friend. I always tell him it was the best sports talk show Detroit's ever seen. And he just didn't want to do it anymore. And we couldn't go on. We couldn't do it without Eli. We just couldn't, because he made all the money on the show, which was not much, just a little bit of money, but he sold the advertising and he was still in Detroit and he was better connected than I was. I haven't lived in Detroit in more than 30 years. Yeah. So he got a lot of the guests. So I got a lot too, but he got a lot of the guests. So it was just, we were doing sports talk radio aimed at a little more sophisticated, a little older audience. And I can't believe there isn't a market for that. I just don't believe that. But go try to tell that to the guy. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm very proud of what we did on that show. It was just a lot of fun. Yeah, we had our feuds. But it was.
But the feuds made it too. I mean, the feuds. I mean, not one of you was afraid to give your opinion. You know.
No, that was the idea of the show.
Yeah, not one of you. So, and when you have Denny McClain in anything, there's a lot of opinions that are going to be thrown around at that time too. And it was
and me too. Eli not quite as much.
Nope.
Eli's a little more circumspect, a little more politic than we are. And I put Eli up tight a few times with some of the things that I said. And as you know, I do accents. With some of the accents that I had made him up a little uptight too. Tough noogies, you know. I mean, whatever. But I'm sorry the show ended because it was just a lot of fun to do, and it is what it is, you know.
We're going to take a quick break here, Bob, and be back in a couple of minutes because I don't have any doctors, but I do have some lawyers as our sponsors. So we're going to take that break. And
congratulations, a podcast with sponsors. Not many people can say that. That's good.
We're here at Spurrier's Gridiron Grill at Celebration Point in the Coach's Podcast Room. I'm with Bob Page. We'll come back and talk about some athletes and some team owners when we get back. Right after this on MotivationU the Podcast.
We still hear it. The sound of victory. The joy of being part of something great. And while things may not be the same right now, we haven't gone anywhere. If you bleed orange and blue, then Meldon Law is the firm for you.
Looking for more reasons to celebrate? We have them here at Celebration Point. Enjoy some of the newest additions to our already celebratory lineup, like Dave & Buster's, Les Macarons, and Prime and Pearl. There's always a reason to celebrate. Join us anytime for any occasion. Celebration Point, where Gators come to celebrate.
Steve Spurrier here. You know, making a reservation at my restaurant is easier than a Saturday afternoon homecoming game against Vandy. You don't have to call or email. Just go to spurriers.com, hit the reservation button, pick a date, a number of guests, and a time. It's so simple, I can do it. In fact, I just did. Maybe I'll see you tonight.
Welcome back to MotivationU the Podcast. My name is Bob Ganzak. We're coming to you live from here at Celebration Point, inside the coach's podcast room at the head ball coach himself, Spurrier's Gridiron Grill. With me is famous broadcaster, commentator, I should say, sports commentator Bob Page. And off air, we were chatting about some different things. And I had mentioned there was a sports writer in Detroit that did an incredible job of taking the, I should say, the negative side to the world, and it really exposed some information. What was your thoughts on Drew Sharp, Bob, and the work that he did?
Basically, the same thought I had about a guy I was once pretty close to, and that would be Bill Walton, and that it's great to be controversial. It's great to be opinionated, but I don't like it when people just throw controversial opinions out there to be controversial. You know what I'm saying? And I think Drew and Bill were guilty of that sometimes. In other words, just deliberately stirring something up that about an issue that hadn't really been broached by anybody, whatever. But I do think this. I mean, Bill's crazy now. I don't know wwhat's happened to Bill. You can't watch him on the game. He's just crazy. He really is. But I had a lot of respect for Drew. I thought he was very good. He was not working in Detroit, I don't think, by the time I left in 1988 to go to New York. But I knew Drew pretty well, over the years. I would see him at events and so on and so forth. And now, I mean, you think the Detroit market misses Drew Sharp? Duh.
Yes.
I mean. One of the things that always flattered me about my career when it got back to me after something major had happened, that people had said, or somebody had said, boy, I can't wait to hear what Page is going to have to say about this tonight. And that was the way it was with Drew Sharp. Something big happened in Detroit sports. Well, I want to see what Drew Sharp writes about this tomorrow. And my mentor, Al Ackerman, was the same way. And two of my former colleagues, one of whom is still alive at 94, and to whom I'm pretty close, Jerry Green and the late Joe Falls. You wanted to read what they had to say about something. Now, if you look at the feckless Detroit sports media now, and basically I'm talking about print guys, if anything really big happens in Michigan sports, about whom do you say that? Boy, I can't wait to see what Mitch Albom is going to write about this. He's a great professional and a brilliant guy, but no. I mean, you don't really say that about anybody, which is too bad. But that's what I thought about Drew Sharp, and that's what I think a lot of people felt about Drew. It's just so shocking when he died. It
was terrible. I mean, he's still a young man, just absolutely terrible. Some of your favorite coaches that you got to interview or had to cover, who were some of the individuals that?
I'll tell you one name.
That's a good guy.
One name that jumps right out at me when you ask that question is Darryl Rogers, the former Michigan State football coach. Darryl was a great guy, funnier than hell. And unlike most football coaches who are so afraid to say anything, we don't want to upset anybody, Darryl just said whatever came to mind, and he didn't care whom it offended, such as the now famous Mark, or University of Michigan people think the infamous remark he made about arrogant asses, Michigan people being arrogant asses. Darryl said it, so, you know what I'm saying? And this is why a lot of people didn't like Darryl, and I've only found out in the last few years that a lot of guys I knew who played for him at Michigan State or with the Detroit Lions hated him. They hated playing for him. Shocked the hell out of me, because he was just, you could talk to him anytime, and a lot of laughs, and as I say, a really nice guy. So Darryl jumps out at me among my favorite people. I mean, how do you dislike Sparky? I covered Sparky for years, He was. I wouldn't have wanted to play for him, and I would not have wanted to play for Bo Schembechler. But, Bo and I had kind of an up and down relationship for a long time, but I'll tell you what, I respected him, and I liked him too. And I liked dealing with Bo, even though sometimes I don't think he liked me very much. But those are, some of the guys I covered for a long time. But, there's so many of them. The late John McLeod, the longtime NBA coach, when he coached the New York Knicks, and I was at the Guard at that time. He's a great guy. Some guys were not. Some guys were not, real good guys. But those are the kind of guys you like. The guys who are really friendly, outgoing. When you're talking to them, you get the idea they're telling you the truth, and they might not care, whom the truth offends. But they're telling you the truth, and they're accessible to you. I covered Pat Riley. He's not a nice guy, and a lot of these guys are just so uptight. They play it so close to the vest. They look at you, a member of the media, as the enemy. In fact, Bill Parcells, when he coached the Giants, had a name for all of us in the media: commies. That's what Parcells called us, commies. So he did a little work for MSG when I was there, and they were going to use part of an interview that I had done, I don't even remember, with somebody. And so they wanted to tell Parcells what was going on and to see the interview so they could, make some comment about it. So the interview's playing, I wasn't on camera, and Parcells says, "Who's doing the interview?" And they told him it was me. He says, "The chief commie." Yeah, I took that as a compliment. So, it's whatever. I mean, it was all interesting, Bob. It was all interesting, whether you like guys or whether they liked you or not,
How did you choose that path? I mean, you were controversial, but you did. It was never a front. That was you. I mean, you were really digging for information. As you said right at the beginning, you hustled, and that hustling came out in the questions you asked. How did you take that path?
If we think about our own lives, all of us, we think back to how much our parents influenced us, however we were influenced. Obviously, those are your two chief influences in life, at least in your early parts. My mother, with whom I did not have a good relationship, my mother was an extremely opinionated person. And my dad, being an attorney, and a corporate attorney, wasn't really that way. But my mom was kind of a rageaholic at times. She'd stomp around the house, expressing her opinions about this and so on and so forth. So that was an influence, when I was a kid growing up, to hear this strong person expressing, strong opinions this way. And then when I got to be a teenager, I turned on the television and I saw Al Ackerman. And as a huge sports fan, Al Ackerman said just what I was thinking. And you were a big fan, Bob. He said just what you were thinking too. Yep. If somebody sucked, if they weren't doing the job, Al Ackerman told you up front in no uncertain terms that they sucked and they weren't doing the job, while you turn on other guys and they're mealy-mouthed. They're just going along, and everything like that because they want to keep their jobs. And I'll give you a perfect example of this. And don't get me wrong, he's still alive. He's a great guy and a fine professional, Ray Lane. Ray Lane never rocked a boat in his entire career. That's how he kept his job. But if you knew Ray, as I did, You would see Ray, you hang out with Ray at certain things. A more opinionated man than Ray Lane never lived. You'd bring up anything about the Tigers or the Lions or whatever you wanted. Ray would just go off on people. And you're sitting there thinking, is this the same guy I see on TV? But he would never say that on the air. So,
Yep.
I mean, Ray kept this. I was fired a number of times, for being so controversial. I always say my kids never missed a meal, and they always had a roof over their heads at night, so it worked out okay.
Yeah, you bring up Ray Lane. It's when I played baseball at the University of Detroit, Ray was one of my almost everyday racquetball partners. You knew Ray? Well, you know what I'm talking about then.
And
then I got to be friends with his son Greg when he and I were playing ball against each other.
He played at Michigan. Greg did.
He did. Yeah. Yes, he did. Yeah. He did. Our life kind of coincided. So, but Ray's still around. Man. My goodness,
he is.
He was the first person that ever told me that he wears shorts on set when he was doing the sports. He would have
well, you know where he got that, right?
No,
you know where he got that?
No,
got that from Dizzy. He got that from Dizzy Dean. Because on hot summer days, when old Diz and Pee Wee were doing the Yankee game of the week, that's what Diz did. He was in his undershorts in the broadcast booth, and at some point, I don't know if they're playing a joke on him or what, but they had a higher camera shot, and they showed him sitting there with his underpants on and his suit and tie, his coat and shirt and tie up front. So I think Ray being the huge baseball guy he was, took a cue from that.
Bob, what was it like covering somebody like George Steinbrenner?
I first, quote unquote, met George when I was at Channel 7 with Al Ackerman, and Al was very impressed that I did this. I don't know, I just wanted to do it. So they're going through the usual BS about, is he going to fire Billy Martin this week, or is he not going to fire Billy Martin? Well, the Yankees were in town, and the Billy Martin watch was on, so George was with them. So I found out somehow where he was staying, the Pontchartrain, and what his room number was. So I went up with a camera crew to George's room, and I said to the camera guy, roll. Then I knocked on the door. George opened the door, 5 inches, and I introduced myself, and I'm interviewing him. He wouldn't come out. I'm interviewing with my microphone through this little 5-inch gap in the door about, is he going to fire George Steinbrenner? And I appreciated the fact that George spoke to me. Then I covered him in New York, and I was surprised one time where he came up to me, actually kissed me on the cheek. I'm so, what? He's, oh, Bob, how are you? He kisses me on the cheek while behind my back complaining to my boss at MSG, because we had the Yankees rights. We did the Yankees games. How can you let Page say these things about us on the air? How can you let Page get away with this? And to his everlasting credit, and he was a very good boss, Bob Gutkowski, would tell George on the telephone, George, you run the Yankees. I run this network. So he stood up for me. But other than that, I never had a problem with George. He was a charming guy. He really was. I was in this, I don't mind telling you, secondhand store down here in South Florida just a couple of years ago. And I found a copy of a book in mint condition written by Peter Golenbach, whom I had on my shows, my half-hour interview shows in New York a number of times. And this was the whole story about Billy Martin's life. And, of course, George Steinbrenner is like, the co-star of the entire book. And you just read this stuff about what their relationship, turning page after page, what their relationship was actually like. It's pretty interesting, to tell you the truth. Of course, George was a manipulator. George was a brilliant guy. George was a troubled man. George was this, but there was nobody like him. Nobody like him.
Did you ever cover a team owner that was just like, I can't stand this guy?
I like to be interviewed by reporters like you, because reporters ask great questions. Well, a team owner I couldn't stand, and let me tell you something, it was not that way with William Clay Ford. He was very friendly. We were on a first-name basis. I called him Mr. Ford, but we were on a first-name basis. He was a nice man, and he was approachable, accessible. He was in the interview room. He was in the locker room. Talk to him anytime you wanted. And then it disappointed me, but I understood it after I had left for New York, and again, 88. that he became a bitter recluse, and you felt so sorry for him because he had no clue. He just had taken the greatest football franchise in the world in the 1950s and destroyed it. And he was being hammered, constantly by people. It was too bad to see that happen. But an owner of a team I really didn't like. There weren't that many. I didn't know Bruce Norris when he owned the Wings, but that was not a good situation. He wasn't accessible. He was a drunk. He just, that wasn't a good thing. Owners of teams in New York, you don't really have. Well, you're a reporter. You know this. You don't really have that much truck with the owners themselves. For instance, I covered the Jets for a long time in New York when Leon Hess was alive. And Leon Hess would come into the locker rooms after games, but he always was flanked by two flacks, whatever you want to call them. He didn't stop to talk to you. I was very fond of, and this is really the reason that I am and always will be a big New York Giants fan. I was very fond of Wellington Mara, the Giants owner, because I came to New York as essentially some nobody from Detroit, and the Giants were a world championship NFL franchise. And Wellington Mara and, other guys, Ed Kropp, the PR guy, whatever, they didn't have to be nice to me. They didn't have to give me the time of day, but they did. They treated me great from day one, and I had so much respect for them, not only because of that, but because they were competent, because the Giants were going to Super Bowls, went to 5 Super Bowls and won 4 of them. How many Super Bowls have the Detroit Lions ever even been to? 0, of course, as we all know. So I liked Wellington Mara, but again, it's not, these guys are very wealthy, very powerful men. Usually you don't just call them up on the phone to BS, So you like guys or dislike guys based upon how they treat people around them. You hear the stories, the stories, and what kind of success they have. So you can figure out the guys I really respected as owners and the guys I didn't.
Yeah. We've been around sports for so long, and being around Detroit, it's been a lot of ineptitude, especially in the football world. How do people like the Rooney family and the Mara family get it right, and the Ford family continues from the Russ Thomas days through the Bob Quinn days to get it wrong?
How about don't forget the Matt Millen days?
I took to the two ends of the
Matt Millen, I think most of your listeners know this, and I'm sure you know this. Matt Millen might still be general manager of the Detroit Lions, bungling his way to further ineptitude had it not been for Bill Ford Jr. When Bill Ford Jr. Had evinced his own ineptitude in attempting to run the Ford Motor Company, he was a featured speaker downtown Detroit one day. Maybe it was the Economic Club of Detroit. I don't know what it was. It was at the Detroit Athletic Club, big luncheon. So all the news reporters were there, not the sports reporters. The news reporters were there. And when Bill Jr. came out, he's a very nice man, he stopped, paused, and answered a lot of questions from all the news reporters. And finally, when they're just about done, I don't know who it was, little voice at the back of the crowd says, "So Bill, what are you going to do about the Lions?" And Bill Ford Jr. looked at him and said, "Look, it's my dad's thing. Had it been up to me, I would have fired Matt Millen a long time ago, but it's my dad's thing." When Bill Ford Sr. saw that, when Bill Ford Sr., because that quote made headlines. When Bill Ford Sr. saw that, the light came on. He got religion and said, if my own son is saying this, I got to fire Matt Millen. So it's just, your podcast is basically about leadership. You want to know what kind of leadership Bill Ford had? The family wouldn't even let him run the company. Yes. I think he served 1 year. I think it was I may be wrong. It was 1955. For 1 year, he was treasurer of the Ford Motor Company. Hank the Deuce ran that company. That's leadership, what he did. But they wouldn't let Bill run the company. So his plaything was the Detroit Lions. He didn't know what to do. He trusted in Russ Thomas, who was not just bungling and incompetent, one of the most evil people I ever knew in sports. Russ Thomas was that bad. Backstabbing, liar, just the worst. And Bill Ford kept him employed all those years.
For a long time. Yeah.
didn't know what to do. And you go on and on about, all of this stuff. We think with pride. In fact, I ask people this question rhetorically sometimes. Name the only franchise in North American team sports that has had the same nickname and played in the same city for more than 100 years. It's not the New York Yankees. It's not Montreal Canadiens. It's the Detroit Tigers. And so we think about that, but we realize the Tigers have only won 4 world championships.
Yep.
4. So, John Fetzer was inaccessible. He ran his broadcasting empire like the skinflint he was. I was around Fetzer, but I don't recall ever having a conversation with him. And then he sold it to that weird guy, Tom Monahan. And Monahan, at least, entrusted Bill LaJoy and Sparky, and they brought him a world championship in 1984, as we know. But, it's just what makes some guys great businessmen. Why is Warren Buffett Warren Buffett? Why is Bill Gates Bill Gates? But why is the businessman who really wants to make money and really is into it, why does his 2 pizza stores go belly up after 3 years? I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well,
you can say, well, intelligence, that's part of it,
But you just answered, I'm 66 years old and been a, Lions season ticket holder and a lot of other things over the years. And you just really answered a question that I never even put one and one together. And that was that Bill Ford wasn't really good at anything.
He wasn't. Born with the proverbial silver spoon in his mouth. He had nothing to do, and he owned nothing except gazillions of dollars. And the Lions became, I guess he bought a partial share in the early 60s. And then the day that Kennedy was assassinated, November 22nd, 1963, the day before my birthday, by the way, never forget that, he somehow got full control of the Detroit Lions and then just continued to run them into the ground. And somebody was tweeting me today, my Twitter account, at Bob Page Sports. And he was saying the Fords have made so much money and the franchise is so valuable. And then there's, the estate taxes with the capital gains taxes. Why would they sell? And I answered him, I said, they would sell due to humiliation. The family's been humiliated all of these years. And for normal people like us, if we try something in life, we do it and we continue to do it, and we find out we're just not good at it. And people they're lampooning us, and yes, they're laughing at us. Any normal person would say, look, I'm not going to be subjected to this. I'm just not good at this. I'm going to get out of this and go find something else to do with my life. Not the Ford family. Not the Ford family.
And you look at, the matriarch of that family is a Firestone. So,
Yeah.
I mean, they're successful.
Can you imagine a 93-year-old woman running an NFL franchise? And as you know,
goodness.
being a listener to our former podcast, I did an imitation of Mrs. Ford all the time on that show.
Yes, you did.
With big meetings about player personnel and stuff like that. And now we have her daughter, I think she's 70. Her daughter is running the Detroit Lions. Why? Sell. Bring in somebody who knows what they're doing. We saw a guy, a brilliant self-made multimillionaire, Mike Ilitch, what he did with the Wings. We saw what he did with the Wings. We saw what he did with the Tigers, although it was a shame the Tigers never quite won that world championship for him. Jury's out on Chris Ilitch, his son, who's now running it. But, I mean, you have to have – it all starts at the top. And when you're the owner, you can't have an outsized ego like Jerry Jones. You have to say, look, I'm the owner, but there are a lot of people who know a lot more about this than I do. So I'm going to find them. I'm going to hire them, and I'm going to delegate full authority to them and let them run my team. And I'm talking, of course, the prime example of that is Bob Kraft and Bill Belichick in New England with the Patriots.
Definitely.
I mean,
great ownership.
It doesn't seem as though it's that difficult a concept, does it? But to these guys,
it's a toy for
egos
them.
don't know bounds.
Yeah, and it's a toy for them. They make so much money.
It is, and I've always railed about this. Yes, it's a toy for them. Yes, they are the owners. Yes, they call the shots. But when you own a franchise, a major franchise like the Detroit Lions, like the New York Yankees, like the New York Mets, anybody we talk about, you have a sacred trust. You are running that team for the millions and millions and millions of diehard fans who don't have the money to buy the team. That team belongs to the community because you're a multi-gazillionaire. You happen to be the owner, so go ahead, call the shots, hire the people, anything like that, while always realizing that this is a sacred trust to the fans of whatever particular city or whatever particular team we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Best leader in sports that you've ever come across or witnessed?
That's a good question. Again, I'm going to stop telling you're asking good questions, but I say that because this is such an easy answer. When I was in New York, I still live in New York, of course, half the year, but I was friends with an amazingly brilliant illustrator named Alan Reingold. Alan painted sitting portraits of presidents like Jimmy Carter for the cover of Time magazine, and it looks just like a photograph. He did one of a hockey player once, and you cannot tell whether this is a photograph or whether this is actually an illustration of painting, which it is. And I have that big thing framed. I got it professionally framed, and it's on the wall of my living room 20 feet away from me as I speak to you, because he was the greatest single leader I ever saw in sports, and there was no one I ever respected more than Mark Messier. Nobody I respected more than Mark Messier. He just put, when he came, of course, along with Gretz, he put the Oilers on his back first. He came to New York and put that whole franchise on his back. Put the whole franchise on his back. And he was he just commanded respect in the locker room, not only by deed, because of course he was one of the greatest players who ever lived, but by his actions and thoughts. Now, compare that to Steve Yzerman, who I think is a great leader too, but Stevie's more of a quiet guy, and Stevie, more than anything, I think, led by example. He played so hard and he played hurt, and he was such a great player, teammates couldn't help looking at him and saying, I want to be like Stevie. Stevie didn't have to sit in the locker room and point fingers at guys, which Mess probably did, and tell them, ship up, pal, or, shape up, pal, or ship out. Mm-hmm. So I would say Mark Messier was the greatest single leader, though obviously there have been a lot of them. I've been lucky enough to have been around, but Mark was the greatest.
That one comes to my mind too. That would have been my answer if the question was asked backwards.
And you weren't even around him. I mean, you've never even met him before. But so even being from Detroit, you hear stories about Messier's leadership, and they're true. And they're true.
Well, you saw what happened on the ice. People would sacrifice whatever.
Yeah.
And that has to come from someplace. It doesn't always come from a coach.
Yeah. There was I'm sure you read this. I tweeted it out. Unfortunately, it's behind a paywall. But Bill Dow in the Detroit Free Press the other day wrote a huge and great feature story on one of our boyhood heroes, and that, of course, was Joe Schmidt.
That was still a great article.
I think he turned 90 this past week. Still sharp as tacks. And you read about Joe talking about the leadership of Bobby Lane when he joined the Lions in the 1950s, and then the leadership role that Joe assumed later on. And you look at what the things this guy says about Lane and the things he says really about himself, and you know what leadership is in sports. You know what it is.
Bob, we're going to have to do this again. Our hour is up. Give us your Twitter feed again so that people can follow you on Twitter and find out more about you.
At Bob Page Sports. And I'm pretty Googleable. If you Google me with Bob Page Sportscaster or something, whether it's Wikipedia or there's a lot of stuff on it. You go to youtube.com and Google my name with Sportscaster. There's a lot of stuff from my career out there everywhere.
I did enjoy though.
Again, Bob, it's been tremendous. I've had so much fun. I never worked a day in my life. And it's been great talking to you today. Thanks for having me on.
I appreciate it, Bob. We'll do this again down the road.
Whenever you want.
Perfect. For my producer, Evan Miller, and for Coach's Podcast Room here at Spurrier's Gridiron Grill, I'm Bob Ganzak. This is MotivationU the Podcast.